Most people think of Australia's ghost towns as gold rush failures, places that ran dry and emptied out slowly over years. But there is another category of abandoned town on this continent, and it does not disappear slowly. It disappears overnight. A single system forms over warm water, tracks toward the coast, and hits a town that was never built to survive it. Some of those towns get rebuilt, some get relocated, and some get used, the storm as cover for something the government wanted to do anyway. Stay for number 1. What happened there was not a natural disaster. It was a natural disaster that the state of Queensland used as an excuse to do something it had been trying to do for years, and the people it was done to are still living with the consequences. Number 10. Victoria Settlement, Northern Territory. In 1838, the British government made its third attempt to plant a permanent military and trading outpost on the northern coast of Australia. The previous 2 had failed. This one, on the Coburg Peninsula at Port Essington, was supposed to be different, a strategic garrison to counter Dutch and French expansionism in the region, designed to grow into a commercial hub comparable to Singapore. Royal Marines under Captain John MacArthur landed on the traditional lands of the Majinbami clan and began building. The problems started immediately. Port Essington was a landlocked harbour with no cooling sea breezes, and the population began suffering from malaria, scurvy, and heat that made daily life barely functional. On the 25th of November, 1839, just over a year in, a tropical cyclone struck the infant settlement. The storm surge swept 3.2 metres across the low-lying peninsula, demolishing the prefabricated timber cottages, the church, and the government wharf. The Royal Navy brig HMS Pelorus was driven hard aground. 12 people died. They rebuilt in stone and brick, using a brickmaker who had been shipwrecked during the same storm. The new buildings were more solid, but the colony still attracted no commercial shipping, no free settlers, and no trade. By 1848, visiting scientists described it as a rotting ruin, houses eaten by termites, soldiers suffering from chronic illness, the whole enterprise quietly falling apart under the tropical sun. In 1849, the British government formally abandoned the settlement, 11 years after arriving. The standing stone chimneys, the partially intact brick gunpowder magazine, and the cemetery remain as ruins inside Garrigunak Balu National Park on the Coburg Peninsula. It is one of the most remote heritage sites in Australia, which is appropriate. It was one of the most remote failed ambitions in Australian history. Number 9. Condon, Pilbara, Western Australia. Before Cossack, before Port Hedland, before any of the Pilbara's modern infrastructure existed, there was Condon. Gazetted as Pilbara in May 1872, it holds the distinction of being the first port settled in the Pilbara, a tidal creek settlement 16 kilometres east of the De Grey River mouth, built to service the major pastoral stations along the De Grey River and later to supply the Nullagin and Molle goldfields. The geography was the problem from day one. The tidal creek silted rapidly and constantly. Larger vessels could not reach the landing. Cargo had to be transferred to lighters far offshore and brought in piecemeal, which made everything more expensive and slower than it needed to be. The low-lying coastal sand dunes offered no protection from the cyclones that regularly crossed the Pilbara coast, and every major storm chewed further into the jetty, the warehouses, and the domestic buildings. When Port Hedland was developed as a deep-water port in the late 1890s, geographically closer to the goldfields and naturally protected, the trade simply migrated. Condon did not close dramatically. It was gradually swallowed by the shifting coastal sand dunes until there was nothing left to close. Archaeological inspections have since found the scattered remnants, timber jetty piles, a stone groin, concrete store foundations, rusted ironclad house ruins with heavy wire ropes still attached to the roof structures, the ropes used to lash the roofs down during cyclones, which tells you something about how they lived, a steel telegraph post, and a small deteriorating graveyard. The wire ropes are still there. The cyclones still cross that coast. Number 8. Old Onslow, Western Australia. Onslow was gazetted in October 1885 at the mouth of the Ashburton River in the Pilbara, cited to export wool from the expanding sheep stations of the hinterland. The problem was immediately obvious to anyone who looked at the map. The mouth of the Ashburton was a dynamic, shallow estuary with a shifting sandbar that caused constant maritime accidents. Ships could not get close. Cargo had to be transferred via lighters from vessels anchored offshore, then hauled 6 kilometres across marshland by horse-drawn tramway to reach the town in 1897. A severe tropical cyclone destroyed the first sea jetty entirely. Subsequent jetties were rebuilt closer to the river mouth, where siltation rendered them useless at low tide. Between 1953 and 1963 alone, Onslow suffered 5 cyclone impacts with gusts exceeding what the infrastructure could withstand, a concentration of severe cyclonic events unmatched by any other Australian town in the same period. In 1912, the town received almost no rain at all. In 1961, 3 distinct cyclones crossed the coast within 5 weeks and swamped it. By 1920, the community had had enough. The Ashburton Roads Board and local pastoralists agreed to relocate the entire town 18 kilometres northeast to a new site at Beeden Point, where the water was deeper and the harbour geometry more forgiving. Throughout 1925, the original town site was systematically dismantled. Residents and their timber-frame homes were moved across the salt flats on camel and donkey-drawn wagons. What they left behind is still standing in parts. The 1893 police station, built from locally quarried coral sandstone in Victorian Georgian style. The original jail cells. Remnants of the 1894 post office and hospital water tank. Structural stabilisation works were completed in 2016, funded in part by the Chevron-operated Wheatstone project, the modern industry that replaced the wool economy, working to preserve the ruins of the economy that preceded it. Number 7, Balla Balla, Western Australia. On the night of the 21st and 22nd of March, 1912, one of the worst cyclones to hit the Pilbara coast drove directly across the settlement of Balla Balla. What happened in the waters offshore that night went far beyond the destruction of a small port town. Balla Balla had been established in the late 1890s on a coastal mud and sand plain overlooking Dupach Island, built to serve as the port and railhead for the Wim Creek copper mines. It had 2 hotels, a blacksmith, a police station, a post and telegraph office, and a 2-kilometre rubble causeway with a narrow-gauge railway connecting the mines to the shipping jetty. It was functional and modest and completely exposed. The cyclone generated winds estimated above 185 kilometres per hour and a massive storm surge. In the waters off Dupach Island, the 1,847-ton steel sailing ship Crown of England was driven onto the rocks and broke into 3 sections, killing 8 crew. The Enterprise II, and the Clio were completely wrecked. The Concordia was driven high onto the beach, and the Adelaide Steamship Company's coastal liner SS Koombana, which had departed Port Hedland for Broome just before the storm, disappeared entirely with between 150 and 158 passengers and crew on board. The Koombana was never found. It remains one of the worst weather-related maritime disasters in Australian history. Balla Balla never recovered. The port continued on a diminished scale alongside the declining copper mine through the 1930s. And then in 1956 another cyclone destroyed the remaining timber jetty infrastructure completely. The town is now entirely abandoned. What remains is a surface layer of historical artifacts, metal footing clamps, concrete rubble, the small causeway road, and a single marked grave on the ridge overlooking the mudflats where the Koombana used to anchor. Number 6, Cossack, Western Australia. Hit subscribe if you want more of this, because number 5 is a story about a coastal liner that sank with over 150 people on board, and nobody has found it yet. But first, the town that built the pearling industry and was left to rot on the harbour it created. Cossack, originally called Tientsin Harbour, was established in 1863 at the mouth of the Harding River in the West Pilbara. It was the first port in the northwest of Australia and the birthplace of Western Australia's pearling industry. By the 1880s, it was a genuinely diverse, multicultural town. Europeans, Japanese, Chinese, Malays, Timorese, and Filipino workers, and the pearling fleet working the harbour was the economic engine of the entire region. The Ngaluma people are the traditional custodians of this country. The pearling, however, depended on the harbour, and the harbour was dying. The Harding River estuary silted continuously and severely. By the late 1890s, larger modern steamships were forced to anchor 5 miles offshore and transfer passengers and cargo by lighter to reach the Cossack jetty. In April 1898, a severe tropical cyclone caused catastrophic damage to the port infrastructure and tore the roof off the newly completed customs house and bond store. At the same time, the pearl beds themselves were being depleted, and the pearling industry was already relocating north to Broome. The government built a new deep-water jetty at nearby Point Sampson between 1902 and 1904. In 1910, all port operations were officially transferred. A small Japanese community stayed on through the 1920s, operating a turtle soup factory in the old bond store. When World War II began, every Japanese resident was interned, and the last viable economic community in Cossack was removed by government order. The town was completely abandoned by the early 1950s. The bluestone buildings, the customs house, the courthouse, the police barracks, all built with iron chains bolted to boulders to anchor the roofs against cyclone winds, are still standing. They are managed today by the Ngaluma and Yinjibandi Foundation as a museum town. The architecture of survival is right there in the walls. The chain anchor points, the heavy wooden shutters, the thick stone construction. None of it was enough to save the harbour, number 5, Clermont, Queensland. On the night of the 27th of December, 1916, Sandy Creek burst its banks in the central Queensland town of Clermont. By dawn on the 28th, a wall of water from the Wolfang Creek catchment surged into the town, and the floodwaters rose 6 feet in 20 minutes. They peaked at 4.8 metres above ground level. Out of a municipal population of approximately 1,500 people, between 61 and 65 drowned. The local cemetery beside the river was so severely eroded that headstones shattered and coffins were carried downstream. Clermont had been established in 1864 as the first inland tropical settlement in Queensland, on Wang-An and Jagalingou country, built on low-lying flatlands between Sandy and Wolfang Creeks. It had survived 4 major floods between its founding and 1896, and it had been built anyway, in exactly the wrong place, because the gold mining at Hood's Lagoon and the copper extraction at nearby Copperfield made the location economically convenient regardless of the geography. The 1916 event was caused by a tropical cyclone that crossed the Queensland coast between Bowen and Mackay and tracked rapidly inland, maintaining its intense inner core structure as it moved into dry country. An estimated 750 millimetres of rain fell within 18 hours across the Sandy and Wolfang Creek catchments. The result was not a slow flood. It was a wall. In the immediate aftermath, the surviving residents refused to rebuild on the flats. The Queensland government passed the Clermont Flood Relief Act 1917, granting land on higher ground approximately 1 kilometre away on the condition that residents build within 12 months. What followed was remarkable. Rather than leaving their buildings behind, the community used steam traction engines to physically move them to the new site. 2-story commercial hotels, the Grand Hotel and the Hotel Leo, were jacked up, placed on wooden rollers, and winched slowly uphill. The Grand Hotel's transit took approximately 4 weeks. During the move, boarders continued sleeping in their rooms and eating meals in the dining room as the building crept toward its new location. The original low-lying town site is now parkland. On Capricorn Street, a replica of a piano hangs in a tree, marking the height the floodwaters reached in 1916. The town moved. The marker stayed behind to show where the water was. Number 4, South Molle Island, Queensland. Not all of the abandoned towns on this list are from the 19th century. In March 2017, severe tropical cyclone Debbie, Category 4, struck the Whitsunday region of Queensland, which attracts nearly 900,000 visitors annually. The South Molle Island Resort, a 188-room property with multiple swimming pools and a golf course on a 28-hectare island at the heart of the Whitsundays, took catastrophic structural damage across its accommodation wings, roofs, and communal areas. The resort had been purchased by the China Capital Investment Group for $25 million in 2016, 1 year before Debbie hit. The cost of rebuilding, combined with insurance disputes and shifting corporate priorities, exceeded whatever the investors calculated the future return to be. The resort has not been rebuilt. It remains on the market as a rotting ruin, its swimming pools cracked and empty, its accommodation blocks open to the weather, the tropical vegetation moving in through the broken windows and across the tennis courts. South Molle is the most visible example of what researchers call the rotting resort trail across the Whitsundays, a string of high-value tourism assets that cyclones have destroyed and corporate owners have walked away from, leaving the environmental liability to transfer back to the state. Brampton Island, in the Mackay region, is in the same condition. Great Keppel Island has been partially demolished. The pattern is consistent. A speculative asset gets hit by a Category 4 system, the remediation cost exceeds the projected yield, and the company chooses to forfeit rather than rebuild. These are modern ghost towns. They are not made of corrugated iron and sandstone. They are made of reinforced concrete and fiberglass, but the mechanism is identical to every entry on this list. The economic rationale for the place disappears, and what is left behind is the infrastructure. Number 3, Exmouth and the Pilbara coast, Cyclone Narelle, 2026. In March 2026, Tropical Cyclone Narelle crossed nearly the entire width of the Australian continent over 11 days, making it the most geographically far-reaching system in recorded Australian history. It formed east of Papua New Guinea, made its first landfall near Lockhart River on the far north Queensland coast as a Category 4, tracked westward across the Gulf of Carpentaria, dumped over 300 millimetres of rain across the already saturated Northern Territory, and then emerged over the warm waters of the Indian Ocean off the Kimberley coast and rebuilt into a Category 4 system again as it tracked south. The second peak forced the complete emergency shutdown of the Gorgon and Wheatstone liquefied natural gas export facilities in the Pilbara, operations run by Chevron and Woodside that supply energy markets across Asia. The shutdown of those facilities moved global energy spot prices. A cyclone crossing a remote stretch of the Western Australian coast created an immediate economic ripple felt in Tokyo, Seoul, and Singapore. As the eye bypassed the Northwest Cape, it hit Exmouth with winds exceeding 200 km per hour. The local airport was extensively damaged. 4 structures were completely destroyed. 27 were severely damaged. More than 50 residents had to be evacuated from the local evacuation centre when the centre itself sustained structural damage. Further south, Narelle destroyed an estimated 80% of Carnarvon's winter banana crop. The town of Oodnadatta, traditionally Australia's driest inhabited place, received more than 50 millimetres of rain in a single night from a related tropical low positioned over the Simpson Desert, isolating the community and cutting all road access. This is not a historical story. This is March 2026. The systems that abandoned Balla Balla in 1912 and drove Onslow to relocate in 1925 are the same systems, and they are not becoming less frequent or less intense. Number 2. Old Onslow, the buildings that didn't move. There is a second Onslow story worth telling separately. When the town relocated to Beaton Point in 1925, not everyone and everything could be moved. The Coral Sandstone Police Station, built in 1893 by the Public Works Department in Victorian Georgian style, was too heavy and too solidly constructed to transport across 6 kilometres of salt flat by camel wagon. So it stayed. The jail cells, the original 1893 cells and a concrete block added between 1906 and 1907, stayed. The remnants of the 1894 post office stayed. The hospital water tank stayed. These buildings have been sitting on the edge of the Ashburton estuary for over 130 years, through every cyclone that the Bureau of Meteorology recorded hitting that coastline, and there have been many. Cyclone Trixie in 1975 recorded the highest wind gust in Australia at the time when it crossed near Onslow. The buildings are still there. The coral sandstone turned out to be the right material. The people who quarried it locally and used it to build a police station in 1893 made something that outlasted the town it was meant to serve, outlasted the economic rationale for the port, outlasted the jetties, the tramway, and the horse-drawn wagons. Structural stabilization works completed in 2016, funded by Chevron's Wheatstone project, which operates out of the new Onslow down the road, have ensured the walls will stand for longer still. The ruins of Old Onslow are there now, off an unsealed track, on the edge of the estuary, waiting for the next system to cross the coast. Number 1. Hull River, Queensland. Hull River Aboriginal Settlement was not a town in the ordinary sense. It was established by the Queensland Government in 1914 under the Aboriginals' Protection and Restriction of the Sale of Opium Act 1897, legislation that is exactly as coercive as its name suggests. It was a state-run forced labour and detention camp on 2,900 acres of Jaru traditional country near what is now South Mission Beach. Aboriginal people from across North Queensland were forcibly removed, transported in chains to Hull River, and made to clear rainforest for banana plantations. The Jaru people built their homes in bark humpies on the exposed beachfront. The European superintendent and his staff occupied timber houses on higher ground. On Sunday, the 10th of March, 1918, a Category 5 tropical cyclone crossed the coast directly over the settlement. The system generated winds estimated between 240 and 288 km per hour and a storm surge of 3.6 meters that swept hundreds of meters inland, reaching high into the forest canopy. Every coastal structure was obliterated. The superintendent and his daughter were killed by collapsing infrastructure. An estimated 40 to 100 Aboriginal residents were swept out to sea or killed by the collapse of the bark dwellings on the beachfront. The only structure that survived was a single concrete flower store, on higher ground, where the European staff's houses had also been. And then the Queensland government made its decision. Rather than rebuilding on Jaru country, police rounded up the surviving residents, injured, traumatised, many having just lost family members to the storm surge, along with other Indigenous people from the surrounding Tully and Cardwell districts. Without consultation and without consent, they were transported in April 1918 to Great Palm Island, 37 miles offshore from Townsville, to establish the Palm Island Aboriginal Settlement. This relocation initiated decades of forced removal and institutional segregation on Palm Island. The Queensland government had been looking for an administrative reason to relocate the Jaru people from their country. The cyclone provided it. The settlement was never rebuilt. The Jaru people were not brought back. Palm Island, which began as an emergency relocation of storm survivors, became one of the most notorious sites of colonial control in Australia's history. At South Mission Beach today, there is an interpretive memorial centre marking what happened at Hull River. The Jaru people are still there, on their country, holding the memory of a disaster that was made into something worse by the people who were supposed to be responsible for them. The cyclone does not choose its targets. It crosses wherever the water is warm and the conditions are right. What determines whether a town survives, relocates, or disappears entirely is never just the wind speed. It is the politics of who gets resources to rebuild, who gets moved at their own request, and who gets moved at someone else's request while the storm is still clearing. Every town on this list answered that question differently. Hull River answered it in the worst possible way, and the answer was made by people who were nowhere near the beachfront when the surge came in. If you want more Australian history that did not make it into the textbooks, subscribe. We go deep every week.